Okay, chapter 22. So, our second to last chapter, 23 is our last one, in case you were not aware. This is Global Processes, Technology, Economy, and Society, 1900 to the present. So remember, the last three chapters look at the modern world where we are now, 1900 to the present. Just each chapter focuses on different things. So this one is Technology, Economy, and Society. All right, so this introduction is about three young people living in Indonesia, and the idea is to show how each one is affected differently by 21st century life, the changing conditions of a globalized world, as it says in the first chapter. And so it shows the good and the bad. You have one person, an uneducated widow, caught up in sex work in Malaysia to support her young child when she had nowhere else to go. Another one, a fisherman, his livelihood threatened by global warming. And the third is an engineer who is able to take advantage of globalization and to further his career. So it's good and it's bad. And it's like a lot of the things that we look at in history as the world becomes closer in a figurative sense. That some people are going to benefit and some people aren't, and some things are going to get better and some things aren't. So again, we've said this over and over again, but it's really important not to make any blanket statements about things in history being good or bad or anything like that. We have to look at it more with more nuance than that. So, as we can see, the globalized world affects young Indonesians not through war, but through less visible processes. So, again, in some parts of the world there are war, but in many there's not. We live in peacetime, but that doesn't mean that there's not, things that are affecting us in a way that's not so obvious. You have migration, you have sex trafficking, climate change, impoverishment, and you have technology and economic globalization. And many others have been affected by similar struggles in the past century. So, this technological innovation that we're talking about has occurred largely where the Industrial Revolution had already taken place. So we're talking about nations that have already industrialized. The countries of Western Europe, the United States, Japan, etc. And after World War II, universities, governments, and corporations drove the process of technological development. And this in partnership with globalization, caused the inventions to spread rapidly. So this has been going on. We tend to think of globalization and technological advances as something as being very, very modern, within our living memory. But this has been something that's been going on, even going back to the Industrial Revolution. Just we tend to attribute the word technology to things like devices, cell phones, iPads, computers, etc. But it really can apply to many other things. And generating the energy for this technological breakthrough has been fossil fuels. So access to things like coal. Originally, coal was one of the main literally fuels that drove the Industrial Revolution. In fact, access to coal is one of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. Later, oil, natural gas, these are the foundations of a modern world economy, which we know has had a negative effect on the environment as well. So again, positives and negatives. So the age of fossil fuels in the 20th century came with huge consumption of these items. And technology allowed fossil fuels to be turned into useful energy, things like electricity, citywide electric grids to run things like streetlights and subways and trolley cars, etc. It also allowed for cheaper lighting, especially at night. It used to be that, you had kerosene lamps, and you had candles certainly, but definitely having electric lights means that you can stay awake longer, which unfortunately means longer working hours. It used to be, your day ended when the sun went down and your day started when the sun came up. And that is clearly not the case for many people in the industrialized world today. And you also have electric motors for machinery and industry being more productive than steam technology. And you have the development in combination with those energy breakthroughs of the internal combustion engine, which, if you don't know, is traditionally what makes a car go. And this results in the decline of the use of horses because you have a faster and more efficient way to move goods and people. But on the negative side, you have a very potent source for greenhouse gases as things like cars became over time less and less expensive, and more people could access them, more and more people had them. It became more of a requirement to just get around in your day-to-day life. And as more people have them, it pollutes the environment even more. So here you can see the use of energy extremely taking a very sharp curve up in about 1950 and continuing to do so. And so this allows for a lot of transportation breakthroughs, dramatic innovations for moving goods and people throughout the 20th century. Again, cars, buses, trucks, container shipping, super tankers, airplanes, air freight. And again, globalization is spreading these innovations rapidly. I mean, just think about the fact that you go to the grocery store and the amount of produce that you can get that doesn't come anywhere near here. It came from a long ways away, and this is possible due to transportation. Or you order something off Amazon and it was made in another country and it can get here. You know, how quickly can it get here? These are all innovations in transportation, among other things. So cars may have had the greatest social and cultural impact. Cheap gasoline helped to ensure that the internal combustion engine would be used going forward, and it has. And over time, car ownership has conveyed freedom. You can get up and go. You can go far. You don't have to go as far as you can walk or your horse can go. Individuality, personal empowerment, status, and it helped to link remote areas with urban areas. Now the state of cars and internal combustion engines are certainly changing now as electric cars are becoming more and more common. So again, we're living within this age. We are talking about trends that are continuing on. And so we're not really making any kind of we're not coming to an end to these things and saying, well, it started and this was the peak and then it ended, because we're still seeing these trends today. Here you can see the world's energy consumption. Those nations in purple are going to be the ones that use the most amounts of energy. So you can see these are, again, the highly developed nations, first world countries, the United States, Western Europe, Russia, Australia, etc. We also have breakthroughs in communication and information. So things like starting with the telephone and the telegraph in the 19th century. Some 20th century innovations then would be radio, motion pictures, television, now more recently computers, cell phones, and the internet. These did originate in the West. So again, the breakthroughs we're talking about originate in countries in which industrialization began, but were global in under a century, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. And this helped to reshape human life. I mean, and it continues to do so. So we're talking about a time period that we are living in. There's no end note to this. Thinking about how news is able to be spread to remote places, initially with the radio, but now we have the 24-hour news cycle, so news never seems to end. It's constantly popping up on our cell phones and on social media, etc. You have television, which informs people in some cases, educates people, maybe not in a lot of cases, but mostly is there for entertainment. And computer allows access to information, online education, which you guys are participating in right now. But there is debate and criticism about control and manipulation by these technologies. There's also, unfortunately, a lot of military breakthroughs. Fortunately and unfortunately, in some cases, these are things that have kept us safe. And in some cases, these are things that have been um, have resulted in massive amounts of death. So think about things like poison gas that was used for the first time in World War I in battle. After World War II, the military has become more technological, which is not surprising considering that technology is becoming more available as we go forward. And since the Cold War, nuclear war has been imaginable. So again, living in the fear that that's possible, though with the fall of the Soviet Union, that has somewhat lessened, but it's still there. The technology is still out there. It's still something to be concerned about. Okay, so globalization of industrialization development in the global south. So outside of where it began. So economic globalization began in the global south in the spread of industrialization. So again, it's because countries industrialize, these kinds of things come through and allow for further development. It became a central priority for government legitimacy to enable that countries were to enable their countries to be able to keep up with the rest of the world. And economic development was an uphill battle because in many cases population had low literacy, low managerial experience, a weak private economy, and very little industrial infrastructure. So without those things, it's very difficult for societies to industrialize and to further expand. And this is difficult when the economy is also already dominated by the West and rival superpowers. So there have been variable outcomes. Many East Asian countries producing for export had the strongest economic growth going forward. You also see the continent of Africa and the Arab world and some of Asia that had little economic growth and declining living standards since the 1960s. So the opposite of what you would expect going forward in time. Again, things don't naturally progress to some sort of a better state. And the variables include geography, natural resources, colonial experiences, cultures, political stability, social equality, economic policy, population growth, and involvement in the world economy. So again, it's very particular to the country in question as to whether or not the outcome of industrialization will be positive or negative. All right, so reglobalization. So World War I and the Great Depression both played havoc on the globalized world. World War I obviously interrupted trade throughout various nations throughout the world. The Great Depression, people not having the income in order to buy things on the scale that they were buying things before. And so that caused, again, the really globalized trade to go down. But now things, post-World War II, you see a renewal of earlier trends, a tightening of the global world. You have things like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so these are things that help to prevent economic contraction and nationalistic excesses. So here we see a picture of a very big container ship. Again, think about how you just have to think about like your most recent purchase on Amazon. I'm assuming here, of course, that you all buy things on Amazon. Maybe you don't. But if you have, just think about where that item originated and how it got to you, and that the fact that you have access to that, and then put yourself in the position of somebody 100 or even 50 years ago and how possible that was, to give you an idea of how quickly globalization is changing people's everyday lives. So capitalist countries are often have often viewed the world as a single market by the 1970s. Again, just how fast you can get an item from miles away is pretty astounding in the modern world. So things like reduced tariffs, those are taxes on imported goods, free capital movement, a mobile workforce, private enterprise, tax and spending cuts, and curtailed government involvement in the economy have opened up the global economy to many countries throughout the world. This allows for goods and capital to be circulated rapidly. It increases global trade. It increases employment in many cases. And you also have financial and commercial economic involvement internationally. Again, think about outsourcing, which has been an issue in the United States, and it's something that comes up quite a bit, the fact that companies can employ, they can be based here in the United States, but employ people more cheaply elsewhere. They might choose to open up production or open up branches in places where they're given tax breaks or looser environmental regulations, and often these are in developing countries. And so, again, that has changed the way that work looks not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries as well. So, this huge, rapid creation of wealth with economic globalizations has had a large impact. Generally speaking, people are living longer. Generally speaking, people are more literate. The more well-off you are, the more time you have to devote to education. You have a decrease in infant mortality, which comes from overall better health, and you have reduced poverty. Now, does that mean that's the case everywhere in the world? No. But generally speaking, when you look at countries that have industrialized, these are some of the positive impacts that we're seeing. But there are still periodic crises that have shaped our history. Think about here in the United States, the 2008 housing market bubble collapse caused lots of people to have to foreclose on homes, huge unemployment, tightened credit, meaning it was more difficult to get a loan, reduced consumer spending. It was definitely not a good time in the economy. This is shortly before I graduated from college, so it was tough to find a job in that economy, and I was lucky to be able to land one, but that was not the case for everybody that I graduated college from. So that, again, is one of those economic crises that seems to happen every now and then. And global economic inequality has been persistent and perhaps growing between and within countries and regions. So this is not something to say like, oh, it's the developed world versus the developing world. Certainly there's a gap that's growing there, but there's often a gap that's growing within countries themselves, within different social classes, within regions of countries even. There have been a lot of resistance to economic globalization. Again, it's not something that's overall good or overall bad. There are good aspects to it. There are negative aspects to it. The differences between the rich global north and the developing global south have come to the forefront of world affairs. There's contention over world trade rules, foreign aid terms, representation in international economic organizations, indebtedness, environmental and labor standards. In the 1990s, an international coalition from rich and poor countries thought corporate globalization favored rich countries and corporations and that it hurt the poor, and this led to a lot of people protesting. Different organizations meant to help globalization. So in 1994, for example, there were protests against Mexico joining NAFTA, which allowed for free trade between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. So again, the idea being that these things are beneficial to wealthier nations and not to poor nations. You also see the decline of the quote-unquote peasantry. So not just peasantry, but people who farm the land. From 1950 to 2000, the number of farmers declined by 80% in Western Europe and Japan, 60% in the United States and Canada, and 50% in Latin America and North and Southwest Africa. This is due to mechanization. Makes it easier for one farm to produce more crops, making it less necessary to have as many farmers, and also the Green Revolution. Another change is that migrant worker numbers have grown in the early 21st century. Certainly there have always, not always, but there have been migrant workers that this has been something that people have chosen to do for a while. But their numbers have grown as we go forward in time. Again, we're living in this time period. And cheaper transportation created a more global food market and more competition. So again, the food you're eating is probably, it may or may not be from anywhere around you, and it likely has come great distances. So that means more competition for the farmers living in your region. But 27% of the world's population still earned a living from the land in 2006. So you also see changing lives in people that work in industry. Industry brought the production line and the quote-unquote scientific management of industry. So this is people not doing a job start to finish as they had prior to the Industrial Revolution, but doing a repetitive job in terms of production. So there's a production line, and because of the idea of scientific management, it's faster and more efficient if you give each person one job within production to do over and over and over again. This helped feed the consumerism of the 1920s, a culture of leisure, a culture of consumption, buy things to free up your time so that you can have more leisure time and then consume more things. Also the standard 2-day weekend, which yes, having the weekend off was not always something that industrial workers had. Women moved into factories starting in World War II in positions traditionally for men, even earlier than that in World War I, but certainly World War II saw a significant increase. And after the war, many were forced to leave those jobs behind as the men returned and sought their jobs back. So consumerism was really embraced after the scarcity of World War II and the Great Depression. In the 1950s, the economy really took off. People were frightened that World War II pulled the United States, for instance, out of the Great Depression. What happens when World War II is over? Will we go back into a depression? Well, we didn't. And that is partially due to the rapid consumerism that people had after, the scarcity of war and the fact that people couldn't buy things during the Great Depression. People wanted more and more things. By the late 20th century, many factories were obsolete in Western Europe and the United States as workers sought employment elsewhere. And again, this is something that is ongoing. We haven't seen the end game, if you will, of this yet. Manufacturing has really moved in vast numbers to the developing world, in which they're able to employ workers cheaper, often people working in very poor working conditions, and with a pay gap between women and men. So the service sectors and the informal economy. So things like service, sales, and knowledge economies grew in industrialized worlds. So you have an emerging consumerism, an increasing population, new communication technologies, and race and gender influence on pay. So again, we're moving into a service economy now in the United States where less people are employed in manufacturing and more in different jobs that would fall under the categories of, again, the service sector. By the end of the 20th century, a less stable service and knowledge economy in developed countries with outsourcing. So work has become outsourced to freelancers, independent contractors, contract workers, temporary agencies, and also, again, outsourced to lower wage countries. And so you have, especially in the global south, you have things like day laborers, small traders, and the black market. So again, the pluses and minuses of outsourcing. So looking more into social life and how these things have affected people's day-to-day life. So the 20th century was partially defined by a prosperous middle class in the global north. And we talked about this. We talked about industrialization and countries that had industrialized earlier. And we talked about, okay, you have upper, middle, and lower classes. Which class benefited the most from industrialization? Well, the middle class. And so the 20th century, the age of industrialization, was really defined by the middle class living the good life, having stable wages, being able to own homes, access to secure healthcare, access to education, access to leisure things that we all enjoy, things like entertainment and travel. And developing countries really only had a middle class like this by the early 21st century. And prior to this, it's strange to think of because, again, if you live in an industrialized country, you're really defined by the middle class. But in some nations, it was pretty non-existent. It was mostly dominated by the very wealthy or the very poor. But middle class status has been under threat by the early 21st century, so in more recent history. Generally, there's less secure employment. There's a loss of manufacturing jobs, which used to be a way to get people into the middle class, or maybe at least the working class. Those are gone. Immigration, decline of labor unions, also populist political backlashes. These have all threatened that the stability of the middle class. And increasingly, the top 1% of developed countries control more than ever. And these are more and more often people who are self-made. So here you see middle class life depicted in Nigeria. So it's not something that's solely limited to Western Europe or to the United States. Things that are also transforming private life. Custom or law no longer solely dictates intimate matters, things like whom to marry, how many children to have, when to start becoming sexually active, what it means to be a man or a woman. And this is seen by some as a liberation to celebrate, or by others an assault on the natural order. And so controversy has arisen and continues to, again, we're living in this, so we haven't seen the end game of these trends. Modernity in personal life. Change agents for personal life include science and technology, industrialization and urbanization, globalization, and migration. All of these have an effect on your personal life, even if you don't stop to think about it. So functions that family used to perform are now often done by a business or a state. Things like factories, offices, large agriculture. Education now takes place outside the home on a large scale. This was not the case. If you go back 150, 200 years, this was not generally the case. Typically, people would be educated at home if they were educated at all. Children are now students instead of workers due to child labor laws in industrialized nations. The trends are that families are becoming smaller as raising children becomes more expensive, partially due to then the educational expenses that are incurred as more and more children want access to college. Divorce rates have increased, and there is a growing variety of family patterns. Another big change has been the separation of sexual life from reproduction. This is bigger than you might imagine. A sexualized public culture, things like in advertising, movies, it's pretty much everywhere on social media. You have more open discussion of sexual topics, an increase in premarital sex in many parts of the world, which has been opposed by many different types of religious faiths. The state has also increasingly become involved in personal life. So, for example, Nazi Germany rewarded large families of quote-unquote good Germans and sterilized and executed undesirables. And in case you think that such things did not happen in the United States, there were sterilization laws in the United States, certainly not on the level of Nazi Germany. But if you want to look into the eugenics movement, there were eugenic laws in certain states allowing the state to decide whether or not a person could be sterilized. And that would be against, it might have been, something that they were in support of, but often was something that was against their will because they possessed quote unquote undesirable genes. So again, not on the level of what we see in Nazi Germany, but it happened here. India sterilized 11 million people between 1975 and 1977 because of population concerns. And probably most famous would be China's one-child family policy, which lasted from 1980 to 2014. The Soviet Union made efforts to liberate and mobilize women. They made efforts towards legal and political equality, marriage being civil, divorce legalized, abortion legalized, and illegitimacy abolished. Women were not forced to take their husband's surnames. Pregnancy leave was mandated, something that we don't see in the United States today. Women were mobilized as workers. And there was a women's department which organized conferences, trained women, published newspapers, provided literacy and prenatal classes, and encouraged women to remove veils. In Turkey is another example. Polygamy was abolished. Women were given equal rights in divorce, inheritance, and child custody. In 1934, they were given the right to vote and hold public office, and Western dress was also encouraged. Feminism also became a global issue in the 20th century, and again, we're still living in it. We're still seeing the trends continuing today. Western feminism was revived in the 1960s, but it had a new agenda. If we think about the feminism of the earlier 20th century, which was focused on suffrage or the right to vote, now was more focused on equal rights for employment. And again, it's often referred to as second wave feminism. And you also see women of color continuing to resist racism and poverty as well as an important part of this second wave. Feminism in the global south is not always related to gender. It's often related to colonialism, racism, poverty, development, political oppression, revolution, and an international recognition that women's rights are human rights. The UN in 1975 had an International Women's Year following a decade for women, and by 2006, 183 countries had ratified the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, though not the United States. Okay, so history in the middle of the stream. I like the way that they describe that because, again, it's hard to draw a conclusion from these trends that we just mentioned because we are literally in the middle of the stream. We don't know, there's no clear ending because we're living within these trends. So historians generally are more comfortable describing the distant past because these are stories with pretty clear endings. So should we speculate about the future? Will things from the past repeat themselves? These are things that are important, and questions about the future are legitimate and important, but who can predict the future? Also, the present day influences how we look at the past, and of course we cannot know what the future holds. We can use history to learn, certainly, and that is the hope that we all historians have. But again, historians can't be responsible for predicting the future based on what happened in the past. So this is the last chapter question for this class. Answer the question, what variations or conflicting feminist perspectives can you see in these sources, and what accounts for those differences?